It began with a piece of antique lace, hidden from the world for 7 long years. On a sweltering August afternoon in 2008, Ethan, a man still finding his footing within the opulent labyrinth of the Caldwell estate, pulled the delicate fabric from a darkness it was never meant to escape. His hands, caked with the dust of forgotten time, trembled slightly as he held the wedding veil. It was a ghost from a past that wasn't his, discovered not in a cherished keepsake box, but behind a false wall in a sealed-off bedroom. He was only trying to renovate the room, to build a home office, a small corner of this sprawling Greenwich, Connecticut mansion that he and his wife Claire could call their own. But the house had other plans. It held its secrets tightly, and he had just unknowingly pried one loose from its cold, silent grip. The room itself was a perfectly preserved monument to a life interrupted. It was Eleanor Caldwell's childhood bedroom, a space untouched since the night she vanished in 2001. Faded photographs of a smiling, vibrant young woman lined the shelves, her eyes full of a future she would never see. Trophies from equestrian events gathered dust next to classic novels, their pages yellowed and stiff. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of old perfume and the profound sadness of abandonment. To Ethan, an architect accustomed to clean lines and new beginnings, the room felt like a tomb. He was an outsider here, a stranger trespassing in the intimate history of the powerful Caldwell family, and the silence felt accusatory, as if the walls themselves were watching his every move, judging his intrusion into their long-kept vigil. His discovery was an accident born of professional curiosity. While measuring the built-in closet, he noticed an inconsistency in the depth, a subtle detail no one else would have seen. A tap on the back panel produced a hollow echo that was distinctly out of place. Driven by an architect's instinct, he retrieved a pry bar from his toolbox. The old wood groaned in protest, then splintered, revealing a dark, narrow cavity behind it. It was not a structural quirk, it was a deliberate concealment, a hiding place expertly crafted to be invisible. Peering into the void, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on a bundle of fabric, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth to protect it from the elements. His heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't a forgotten heirloom. This was something someone had desperately wanted to remain unfound. Gently, he reached in and pulled out the bundle. Unwrapping the protective cloth, he revealed the antique lace wedding veil. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a cascade of intricate floral patterns and seed pearls that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The fabric was soft, almost weightless, but it felt heavy with significance. This was the veil Eleanor Caldwell was supposed to have worn on June 15, 2001, the night she was last seen alive. It was a powerful symbol of a wedding that never concluded, of a promise that dissolved into a mystery that had haunted this family for years. Holding it, Ethan could almost feel the phantom presence of the woman who had worn it last, a chilling sensation that ran up his arms. This object did not belong here, tucked away in the dark like a shameful secret. The official story, the one the world had accepted, was simple and tragic. Eleanor Caldwell, the brilliant 24-year-old heiress, had succumbed to pre-wedding jitters. After a public argument with her fiancé, Julian, she had simply walked away from her own lavish reception, vanishing into the night. The media had painted her as a runaway bride, a privileged girl who couldn't handle the pressure of her own gilded life. The Caldwell family, led by their powerful patriarch Richard, played the part of the grieving, bewildered parents perfectly. The case grew cold, the headlines faded, and Eleanor's disappearance became just another piece of tragic local lore, a ghost story whispered among the elite of Greenwich. For 7 years, that was the only truth anyone knew, a neat, tidy explanation that covered up a far more complicated reality. Back in the suffocating stillness of Eleanor's room, Ethan's fingers detected something else within the veil's delicate folds. It was a small, stiff object, carefully tucked deep inside the lace. With meticulous care, he worked it free. It was a single sheet of paper, folded into a tight, neat square, its edges yellowed with age. The paper was crisp, preserved perfectly within its silken tomb. This was no random scrap. Its placement was deliberate, its concealment an act of profound secrecy. The veil was a distraction, a beautiful, tragic symbol, but this small note felt like the real discovery. It was the heart of the mystery, the voice from the past that had been waiting patiently in the darkness for someone to finally listen. An inexplicable sense of dread washed over him as he prepared to unfold it. He carefully opened the note, the old paper crackling in the oppressive silence of the room. The handwriting was elegant, slightly rushed, written in a deep blue ink that had faded but remained perfectly legible. The message was short, cryptic, and utterly explosive. It read, "Meet me at the boathouse at midnight, away from him. Bring the documents. I'll be waiting. A." Each word landed like a hammer blow, systematically demolishing the 7-year-old narrative of the runaway bride. This wasn't an impulsive flight. It was a planned rendezvous. It wasn't about escaping a wedding. It was about executing a clandestine exchange. And it involved a mysterious third party, someone identified only by a single, damning initial. The carefully constructed story of a young woman overwhelmed by emotion was instantly replaced by something far more sinister. The note changed everything. The phrase "away from him" was a chilling indictment, suggesting a threat, a reason for such desperate secrecy. Was him the jilted groom, Julian, with whom she had argued so publicly? Or was it someone else entirely, a more powerful figure lurking in the shadows of the Caldwell dynasty? And what were the documents? Legal papers? Financial records? Something valuable enough to warrant a secret midnight meeting on the night of her own wedding? The note transformed Eleanor from a passive victim of her own anxieties into an active player in a dangerous game. She wasn't running away from her life. She was running toward something, or perhaps with someone, and she had a clear, calculated purpose. Ethan stood frozen in the dusty shaft of light, the note in one hand and the veil in the other. He was no longer just an in-law renovating a spare room. He was the custodian of a secret that had the power to unravel one of America's most powerful families. The grand estate outside, with its manicured lawns and imposing facade, suddenly felt like a crime scene that had been dormant for 7 years. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed menacing, filled with unspoken truths and carefully guarded lies. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that what he held in his hands was not just a piece of the past. It was a key, and it was about to unlock a story far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The world seemed to shrink to the size of the small yellowed paper in Ethan's hand. The air in the room, already thick with the dust of 7 years, became suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. He read the note again, and then a third time, his eyes tracing the elegant, hurried script as if the ink itself might offer more answers. Away from him. The words were a physical blow, a chilling, accusatory phrase that hung in the dead air. Suddenly, the silence of the mansion wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken secrets. He was no longer just an architect renovating a room. He was a trespasser who had stumbled upon the heart of a carefully constructed lie, and the ghost of Eleanor Caldwell felt terrifyingly present, her story demanding to be heard through this single, fragile piece of paper. His mind reeled, a frantic cascade of questions and terrifying possibilities. Who was him? The jilted groom, Julian, whose public argument with Eleanor had been the cornerstone of the runaway bride narrative? Or was it someone closer, someone with more power? Richard Caldwell, the patriarch who ruled his family and his empire with an iron will, came to his mind unbidden. The note didn't just suggest a secret meeting. It suggested a flight from a tangible threat, a person so dangerous that Eleanor had to orchestrate her escape on the very night she was meant to be celebrating. The delicate lace veil in his other hand, once a symbol of lost love, now felt like a shroud, a beautiful distraction from the far more sinister truth it concealed. An overwhelming wave of concern for his wife Claire washed over him. She was Eleanor's cousin, A woman who had spent her entire life navigating the treacherous emotional currents of the Caldwell family, always feeling like she was on the outside looking in. This discovery, this proof of a deeper, darker story, would not bring her closure. It would rip open old wounds and potentially place her in unimaginable danger. He had married into this world of immense wealth and privilege, but he was only just beginning to understand the suffocating pressure and the ruthless dynamics that governed it. His primary instinct shifted from curiosity to a fierce protective urge. He had to shield Claire from whatever darkness this note was about to unleash upon their lives. The phrase "bring the documents" echoed in his thoughts, adding a cold, transactional layer to the mystery. This wasn't a simple elopement with a secret lover. This was a calculated exchange. What kind of documents could be so important that they required a clandestine meeting at midnight on one's wedding night? Financial records? A deed? Evidence of a crime? The implications were staggering, transforming Eleanor from a flighty, emotional bride into a determined woman engaged in a high-stakes game. She wasn't running from a wedding. She was running with leverage. This single sheet of paper expanded the scope of her disappearance from a family tragedy to something that could involve corporate espionage, blackmail, or a conspiracy that had been successfully buried for 7 long years. With a surge of adrenaline, Ethan's hands began to move with a desperate urgency. He carefully refolded the note, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign, and tucked it back deep within the layers of the antique lace veil. He then wrapped the veil in its protective oilcloth, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every sound from outside the room, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the creak of the old house settling, felt like an approaching footstep. He shoved the bundle back into the dark cavity behind the closet wall and hastily tried to reposition the splintered wood panel. It was a crude fix, but he hoped it would hold for now. In that moment, by concealing the evidence, he felt a profound shift within himself. He was no longer a neutral observer. He had become a keeper of the secret. Leaving the room felt like escaping a tomb. He pulled the heavy oak door shut, the click of the latch echoing loudly in the hallway. The rest of the sprawling mansion, with its sun-drenched corridors and priceless art, now seemed like an elaborate stage set. The portraits of Caldwell ancestors lining the walls appeared to watch him with accusatory eyes, their painted smiles, knowing and sinister. He saw the perfection of the estate not as a testament to wealth, but as a meticulously maintained facade designed to hide the rot and decay within. He was an outsider who now knew the truth, or at least the beginning of it, and the knowledge made him feel profoundly isolated and unsafe within the very walls he was supposed to call home. He found Claire in the rose garden, tending to the heirloom blooms that had been her grandmother's pride. The sight of her, so calm and at peace in the afternoon sun, created a painful knot in his stomach. How could he possibly shatter this tranquility? How could he bring the ghost of her long-lost cousin into this perfect moment? He walked towards her, the words he needed to say feeling like stones in his throat. Every step felt heavier than the last, as he carried the weight of the discovery from that dark, forgotten room out into the bright, open air. He knew that once he spoke, their lives, and her perception of the family she had always tried to please, would be irrevocably fractured. He didn't need to say much. He simply held out the small, folded note, his hand trembling slightly. He watched as Claire took it, her brow furrowed in confusion before her eyes scanned the elegant handwriting. He saw the precise moment, the meaning of the words registered. It was like watching a statue crumble from the inside out. The vibrant color drained from her face, leaving her skin pale and translucent. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. But what struck Ethan most was the look in her eyes. It wasn't just shock or grief. It was a deep, chilling, and familiar fear. The same fear he saw whenever she spoke of her uncle, Richard. It was the fear of a known and present danger. Her first words were not a question, but a desperate, whispered command. "Put it back, Ethan, please! We have to put it back where you found it. No one can ever know we saw this." Her reaction was immediate, instinctual. and it told him everything he needed to know about the family she came from. The Caldwell way was not to confront the truth, but to bury it deeper, to maintain the flawless exterior at all costs. Her fear wasn't for the dead, it was for the living. She wasn't afraid of the ghost of Eleanor. She was terrified of what the powerful, living members of her family would do if they knew this secret had been unearthed. The real threat wasn't in the past. It was still walking the halls of this very house. But Ethan knew they couldn't put it back. Standing there in the sunlit garden, looking at his terrified wife, he understood that this piece of paper was more than just a clue. It was a responsibility. It was a voice from the grave that had chosen him to listen. To ignore it would be to condemn Eleanor to the false narrative created for her, and to leave Claire forever living in the shadow of the family's oppressive secrets. The implicit promise of the note was now clear to him. Uncovering what happened to Eleanor was no longer just about solving a 7-year-old mystery. It was about liberating his wife from the toxic legacy of her family and seeking justice for a woman who had been silenced long ago. The decision hung in the air between them, a silent, mutual understanding that their lives had just been cleaved in two, the time before the note and the harrowing, uncertain time that would come after. The antique veil and its hidden message were a point of no return. The quiet, comfortable life they were building in a small corner of this grand estate was over. It had been an illusion, and the reality was far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The official story of the runaway bride was a lie, and they were now the sole guardians of that explosive truth. Their journey was no longer about renovation and new beginnings. It was about unearthing a dark history, no matter the cost. To understand the silence that followed, one must first understand the world it was born from. The Caldwell estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was less a home and more a kingdom, a sprawling testament to old money and unyielding power. In the summer of 2001, its manicured lawns were greener, its marble floors more polished than ever, all in anticipation of a union that would solidify the dynasty for another generation. Presiding over it all was Richard Caldwell, a patriarch whose influence extended far beyond the estate's wrought iron gates. He was a man who valued control above all else over his business, his reputation, and most certainly his family. The air within the mansion was always perfectly climate-controlled, yet it carried a distinct chill, a constant reminder that every word and action was being weighed and measured against the family's flawless public image. At the center of this gilded world was Eleanor Caldwell. To the public, she was the brilliant 24-year-old heiress, a beautiful and spirited young woman poised to marry well and settle into a life of quiet privilege. But those within the inner circle knew the truth. Eleanor was a force of nature, a strategic thinker with a vision for the family's corporate empire that was far more progressive and ethical than her father's ruthless approach. She wasn't just getting married. She was on the cusp of assuming control, a transition Richard publicly supported but privately dreaded. Her disappearance was not just the loss of a bride, but the silencing of a future leader who threatened to dismantle the very foundations of the old guard's power structure. Her intended groom was Julian Vance, a man who seemed sculpted from the same marble as the Caldwell estate. Handsome, ambitious, and from a respectable family, he was the perfect consort for an heiress. Their engagement was celebrated in the society pages as a modern fairy tale, a merger of two influential families. Yet beneath the surface of their picture-perfect romance, fissures were beginning to show. Their arguments, once private disagreements, had grown more frequent. They weren't about floral arrangements or guest lists. They were about power. Julian struggled with the reality that he would always be second to Eleanor's ambition and her role as the head of the Caldwell conglomerate, a future she was unwilling to compromise for anyone. Living in the periphery of this grand drama was Claire, Eleanor's cousin. Where Eleanor was a blazing sun, Claire was a quiet shadow, forever trying to find her place in a family that prized strength and brilliance above all else. She had grown up admiring Eleanor's fire, while simultaneously feeling the sting of being constantly compared to her. Her loyalty to the family, particularly to her formidable uncle Richard, was absolute, born from a deep-seated need for approval that had never been fully granted. She loved her cousin, But her feelings were a complex tapestry of envy, affection, and a quiet resentment for the effortless way Eleanor commanded the attention Claire so desperately craved. This internal conflict would later become the crucible in which her loyalties were tested. The night of June 15, 2001, was meant to be the pinnacle of the Caldwell legacy. The estate was transformed into an ethereal wonderland, with thousands of white roses flown in from Ecuador and crystal chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow over the 300 esteemed guests. Every detail was curated to project an image of effortless perfection and unbreakable unity. The orchestra played Vivaldi, champagne flowed from towering fountains, and the air buzzed with the polite, restrained chatter of the East Coast elite. Yet, for those who knew where to look, the tension was palpable. It was in Richard's tight smile, in Julian's stiff posture, and in the restless energy that seemed to radiate from the bride herself, a sense that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. This simmering tension finally boiled over around 11:30 p.m. Near the grand ballroom's terrace, visible to dozens of guests, Eleanor and Julian engaged in a heated argument. Voices were raised, gestures became sharp, and the carefully constructed facade of the perfect couple shattered in an instant. Guests averted their eyes, pretending not to hear the sharp, cutting words exchanged between the bride and groom. The confrontation ended abruptly when Eleanor turned on her heel and walked back into the main house, her jaw set with a look of cold, unwavering determination. This public spectacle would become the cornerstone of the official narrative, the convenient, easily digestible explanation for what was to come. It was the perfect red herring, masking a far more complex and sinister truth. In the hours and days that followed, the story solidified with terrifying speed. Eleanor Caldwell, the brilliant heiress, had succumbed to pre-wedding jitters and fled. Richard Caldwell, a master of public relations, steered the narrative with surgical precision. He portrayed his daughter as a sensitive, overwhelmed young woman who had simply cracked under the pressure. He expressed his profound grief and bewilderment, playing the role of the devastated father so convincingly that the media and the public accepted it without question. The police investigation was brief and superficial, heavily influenced by the family's immense power. The case of the runaway bride grew cold, eventually fading from the headlines to become a tragic piece of Greenwich lore, a ghost story whispered at cocktail parties. 7 years later, the Caldwell estate remained a monument to that night, beautiful and frozen in time. The tragedy had settled into a quiet, manageable grief, a part of the family's complex history. It was into this carefully maintained silence that Ethan, Claire's new husband, arrived. An architect by trade, he was a man of logic and reason, an outsider unaccustomed to the unspoken rules and oppressive emotional currents of the Caldwell dynasty. When he and Claire moved into a wing of the vast mansion, it was with the hope of building a new life. The decision to renovate Eleanor's long-sealed childhood bedroom into a home office was a practical one, a simple act of moving forward. Neither of them could have known that in disturbing the dust of that forgotten room, they were about to awaken the ghosts of the past. Richard Caldwell was a man carved from granite and ambition, a titan of industry who saw the world as a chessboard and his family as the most valuable pieces. His affection was conditional, measured in loyalty and obedience. He had built a corporate empire through ruthless acquisitions and an unwavering belief in his own infallibility, and he managed his household with the same iron fist. To the public, he was the benevolent patriarch, a pillar of the community who doted on his brilliant daughter. But behind the closed doors of the Greenwich estate, his praise was a tool of manipulation, and his disappointment was a cold, suffocating force. He didn't just want his daughter to succeed. He wanted her to succeed in the exact manner he had prescribed, ensuring his legacy remained untarnished and, most importantly, under his ultimate control. Eleanor, however, was not a pawn to be moved. She possessed her father's intelligence, but tempered it with a modern conscience he found both baffling and threatening. She saw the future of Caldwell Industries not in hostile takeovers, but in sustainable practices and ethical leadership. For months leading up to her wedding, she had been quietly drafting proposals, outlining a complete corporate restructuring that would shift the company's focus and, in the process, render her father's old-guard tactics obsolete. She wasn't just planning to inherit an empire. She was planning to dismantle and rebuild it from the ground up. This wasn't youthful idealism. It was a calculated, strategic rebellion, and she knew her father would see it as the ultimate betrayal, a direct assault on the very foundation of his life's work. The relationship between father and daughter had become a silent, cold war fought over boardrooms and dinner tables. Richard saw her impending marriage to Julian Vance as the final piece in his grand design, a union that would stabilize the family's public image and subtly tether Eleanor to a more traditional path. He believed that once she was a wife, her corporate ambitions would soften, becoming more manageable. Eleanor, in turn, saw the wedding as a smokescreen. She played the part of the devoted bride-to-be, allowing her father to believe he was winning, all while finalizing her plans to seize control of the company. Their smiles and family portraits were masks, hiding a deep, irreconcilable conflict over power, legacy, and the very soul of the Caldwell name. Julian Vance was trapped in the crossfire of this dynastic struggle. He genuinely admired Eleanor's fire and intellect, but he was also a man of tradition, raised to believe in a certain order of things. He envisioned a partnership, but on terms where he was an equal, not a consort to a queen. The closer the wedding loomed, the more he felt the crushing weight of Eleanor's ambition and the immense shadow of the Caldwell legacy. Their arguments were born from this fundamental incompatibility, his desire for a semblance of a normal life clashing with her destiny to command an empire. He wasn't weak, but he was outmatched by the scale of her plans, and his frustration made him the perfect, tragic figure to be cast as the spurned lover in the story of the runaway bride. Claire, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines with a heart full of conflicting loyalties. Growing up, she had been the quiet, overlooked cousin, her own accomplishments paling in comparison to Eleanor's dazzling brilliance. This fostered a deep-seated need for approval, which she sought from her Uncle Richard. He offered her just enough paternal warmth to keep her devoted, making her an unwitting ally in his efforts to manage Eleanor. Claire loved her cousin, but she also envied the effortless way Eleanor defied the family's expectations, a defiance Claire herself would never dare to attempt. This internal turmoil made her blind to the true nature of her uncle's control, predisposing her to accept the simple, tragic narrative of her cousin's disappearance without question, because questioning it would mean questioning her entire world. The documents mentioned in the note were the culmination of Eleanor's secret war. They were not love letters or blackmail material, but a meticulously prepared share transfer agreement, legally drafted and ready for execution. This document, once signed, would leverage a clause in the company's bylaws established by her grandfather, effectively transferring controlling interest of the entire Caldwell conglomerate to her. It was a bloodless coup on paper, a brilliant legal maneuver that would demote her father to a figurehead. She had planned to execute this transfer in the weeks following her wedding, using her honeymoon as a cover for the final corporate consolidation. The documents were her declaration of independence, the weapon she intended to use to finally break free from her father's suffocating grip and reshape the future in her own image. The day of June 15, 2001, dawned with an almost cinematic perfection, a warm sun casting a golden haze over the estate. But beneath the surface of polite celebration, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Guests marveled at the opulence, the flawless execution of every detail, unaware that they were witnessing the final act of a high-stakes family drama. Eleanor moved through the crowds with a serene, almost detached grace, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She was playing a role, the beautiful bride, while her mind was on the midnight rendezvous at the boathouse. Every congratulatory handshake and toast felt like a countdown to the moment her real life would begin, a life she had meticulously planned, far away from the gilded cage her father had built for her. The public argument with Julian on the terrace was not an act of impulse, but one of necessity. It was a deliberate, calculated move to create a public reason for her to be upset, to be seen leaving the reception alone. It provided the perfect cover for her to slip away unnoticed, to retrieve the documents from her room, and to head for the boathouse. Her sharp words to Julian were not just about their failing relationship. They were her final, severing tie to the life that had been planned for her. When she turned and walked back into the main house, it wasn't a retreat into sorrow. It was a determined stride toward her future, a future that hinged on a secret meeting, a set of documents, and a mysterious ally waiting in the darkness. After a night spent staring at the ceiling, the silence of the mansion pressing down on them, Ethan and Claire made a decision. It wasn't a choice born of courage, but of necessity. The note couldn't be reburied. Its elegant script was seared into their minds, a testament to a truth that refused to stay silent any longer. Claire's initial, instinctual fear had been replaced by a fragile, trembling resolve, bolstered by Ethan's unwavering calm. With the first rays of dawn painting the sky in shades of gray and rose, Ethan picked up his phone. He didn't call the family lawyer or a trusted friend. He dialed the non-emergency line for the Greenwich Police Department. His voice was low but steady as he reported new evidence in a 7-year-old cold case. In that moment, the quiet, comfortable life they had envisioned for themselves shattered completely, and they stepped willingly into the storm. Detective Ava Miller arrived just before 10 a.m. Her unmarked Ford sedan was a jarringly normal sight against the imposing, ivy-covered facade of the Caldwell estate. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a presence that was both unassuming and utterly commanding. She didn't pause to admire the architecture or the perfectly manicured grounds. Her eyes scanned the property with a practiced, analytical gaze, assessing security cameras, sightlines, and potential exit points. Richard Caldwell met her at the massive oak doors, his expression a perfect blend of weary grief and civic duty. But Miller's handshake was firm, her eyes direct and unintimidated. She was not a guest to be charmed or a journalist to be managed. She was the official, unyielding embodiment of a justice that had been delayed for far too long, and her arrival signaled the end of the family's control over the narrative. Miller conducted the initial interview with Ethan and Claire in the formal library, a room where the scent of old leather and wood polish hung heavy in the air. Ethan, an architect accustomed to precision, calmly recounted his discovery, detailing the exact measurements that had tipped him off to the closet's false back. He described the veil, the oilcloth, and the folded note with factual clarity. Beside him, Claire was a portrait of tension, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. She confirmed Eleanor's handwriting, her voice barely a whisper. Miller listened patiently, her gaze missing nothing, not the way Claire flinched at the mention of her uncle's name, nor the protective way Ethan's hand rested on the small of her back. The note, now sealed in a sterile evidence bag, lay on the polished mahogany table between them, a fragile catalyst for the chaos that was about to be unleashed. Armed with the note and the couple's testimony, Detective Miller left the estate and returned less than 3 hours later. This time, she wasn't alone. She held a search warrant, a legal document that granted her team unrestricted access to every square inch of the sprawling Caldwell property. The warrant was a physical manifestation of her authority, a piece of paper that systematically dismantled the invisible walls of power and privilege that had protected the family for 7 years. She served it to Richard in his study, where he stood flanked by 2 stern-faced lawyers. He accepted the document with a stony expression, the mask of the grieving father momentarily slipping to reveal the cold fury of a king whose castle was being invaded. The search was no longer a request, it was an order. The secrets of the estate were now officially under investigation, and no room would remain locked. The arrival of the forensic teams was a quiet, methodical invasion. Vans and cruisers lined the long, winding driveway, and the pristine grounds were soon crisscrossed with yellow police tape. Officers in sterile white coveralls moved through the mansion's opulent rooms, their modern equipment a stark anachronism against the backdrop of priceless antiques and ancestral portraits. They descended upon Eleanor's childhood bedroom, meticulously documenting and photographing the hidden compartment behind the closet wall. Every surface was dusted for fingerprints, every fiber catalogued. For Ethan, it was a validation of his instincts. For Claire, it was an agony, watching strangers dissect the sacred, silent spaces of her memory. She felt like a trespasser in her own history, as the house was forced to give up the ghosts it had held for so long. The note's cryptic message, "Meet me at the boathouse at midnight," made the lakeside structure the immediate focus of the search. It was a picturesque building at the edge of the property, weathered by years of sun and rain. The investigative teams descended upon it with focused intensity. Divers, their lights cutting through the murky green water of the private lake, conducted a grid search of the bottom. A sonar boat mapped the depths, looking for any anomaly. The boathouse itself was painstakingly examined, with forensics teams pulling up floorboards and checking the rafters. The air was thick with a tense, hopeful anticipation. Yet, as the hours dragged on, it became clear the search was fruitless. They found old fishing tackle, decaying ropes, and layers of dust, but no documents, no weapon, and no sign that Eleanor had ever made it to her rendezvous. With the boathouse yielding nothing, Detective Miller recalibrated her approach. A dead end wasn't a failure, it was a piece of information. It suggested the plan had been interrupted before it ever reached the lake. She shifted her focus from the destination to the point of origin, the main house. She requested all the original event plans from the 2001 wedding, spreading the large blueprints and vendor manifests across a makeshift command post on the patio. She wasn't just looking for clues anymore. She was hunting for a logistical opportunity, a blind spot in the meticulously planned chaos of the reception. She traced the movements of staff, the placement of security, and the flow of guests, trying to answer a single, critical question. How do you make a person vanish from the middle of a party with 300 witnesses? Her eyes landed on an item in the catering manifest. To accommodate the lavish menu, the event company had brought in 6 industrial-grade freezers. According to the checkout forms, 5 were removed the following day. One, however, was listed as having been purchased by the Caldwell estate for future use. A quick check with the current groundskeeper confirmed its location: a large, disused storage pantry off the main ballroom service corridor. It was a forgotten space, now filled with stacked chairs, old decorations, and boxes of seasonal linens. A place no one had a reason to enter. A place perfect for hiding something, or someone. A chilling certainty settled over Detective Miller. She knew the boathouse was a distraction. The real secret was much closer. She gathered her lead forensic officer, her voice low and steady. "Let's go check the ballroom pantry." The ballroom pantry was a forgotten pocket of the grand estate, a place where time had seemingly stopped. Dust motes danced in the single beam of Detective Miller's flashlight, illuminating stacks of gilded chairs, boxes of holiday decorations, and the spectral shapes of forgotten furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick with the scent of decay and disuse, a stark contrast to the perfumed opulence of the main house. The industrial freezer stood against the far wall like a stainless steel tombstone, its surface dull and streaked with grime. It was an object of pure utility, jarringly out of place amidst the discarded elegance. Miller's team moved with a quiet, methodical purpose, clearing a path through the clutter. Every rustle of a dust sheet, every scrape of a box on the concrete floor, seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence, each sound building the unbearable tension of what they might find inside this cold, metal box. The freezer was a hulking commercial-grade unit, its power cord coiled and dusty on the floor beside it. It hadn't been running for years, yet the heavy rubber seal around the lid remained perfectly intact, fused shut by time and pressure. One of the forensic officers produced a pry bar, inserting the flattened tip into the seam. The silence in the pantry was absolute, broken only by the officer's grunts of exertion and the protesting groan of metal. With a final, sickening crack, the seal broke, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. A wave of frigid, musty air rolled out, carrying a faint, chemical scent that was both sterile and unsettling. For a beat, no one moved. They simply stood on the precipice of the discovery, the open lid, a dark maw promising to reveal a truth that had been locked away for 7 long years. Detective Miller leaned forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside. The light first landed on a cascade of white fabric, stiffened and yellowed with age, its texture like brittle parchment. It was lace, intricate and delicate, unmistakably the bodice of a wedding dress. As her eyes adjusted, the form beneath the fabric became horrifyingly clear. It was a human body, curled on its side as if in a deep sleep, preserved in the residual cold of its hermetically sealed tomb. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the officers behind her. The runaway bride had been found. She had never left the estate. She had been here all along, lying in a frozen, silent vigil just 100 feet from the ballroom, where her family and friends had danced, mourned, and eventually moved on with their lives. The body was Eleanor Caldwell. The airtight environment had preserved her with chilling perfection. Her skin was alabaster pale, stretched taut over the delicate bones of her face. Her dark hair was fanned out around her head, a stark contrast to the frost-rimed interior of the freezer. She was still wearing the remnants of her designer wedding gown, the silk and pearls, now dulled by time but undeniably hers. Her position was not one of struggle, it was one of repose, her hands resting near her chest. This peaceful posture was the most disturbing detail of all, suggesting she had been placed inside after death, a final, cold act of concealment. The scene was a grotesque tableau of interrupted beauty, a fairy tale princess, locked not in a glass coffin, but in a cold, steel box, her story frozen in its tragic final chapter. From their designated waiting area in the sunroom, Ethan and Claire felt the shift before they heard any official word. The methodical hum of the investigation outside suddenly ceased, replaced by an unnerving quiet, followed by a flurry of hushed, urgent radio communications. Officers who had been conducting grid searches on the lawn began moving with a new, grim purpose toward the ballroom's service entrance. Claire stood by the window, her hand pressed against the cool glass, her body trembling. She didn't need to be told. She saw the grim set of a young officer's jaw, the way another averted his gaze as he passed. The truth was a palpable wave of cold that washed over her, far more chilling than the August air. "They found her, Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. The ghost that had haunted her family for 7 years had just become terrifyingly real. Detective Miller's voice cut through the shocked silence in the pantry, calm and authoritative. "Seal it off. This is the primary crime scene. Nobody else enters without my direct authorization. Get the coroner and the ME on the line now." The quiet, methodical work of the initial search exploded into a controlled whirlwind of official procedure. Yellow tape was immediately strung across the pantry doorway, creating a stark visual barrier between the world of the living and the tomb they had just uncovered. Forensic photographers began meticulously documenting the scene from every conceivable angle, their flashes illuminating the dusty corners of the room in stark, repetitive bursts. The search for a missing person was over. In its place, a homicide investigation had begun, its epicenter this small, forgotten room and the tragic secret it had guarded so well. The profound, stomach-turning irony of the discovery settled heavily on everyone present. Eleanor Caldwell had vanished from the heart of her own lavish wedding reception, an event attended by 300 of the East Coast's most influential people, only to be found mere steps away. For 7 years, theories had swirled about her escaping to Europe, starting a new life under an assumed name, or meeting with foul play in some distant, lonely place. The truth was infinitely more brazen and horrifying. She had been hidden in plain sight, a silent, frozen guest, at every subsequent family gathering and holiday held in the grand ballroom. The very freezer brought in to keep the champagne and canapes chilled for her celebration had become her coffin. The house itself had been her mausoleum, its opulent walls guarding a secret far darker than anyone had dared to imagine. This grim discovery answered the 7-year-old question of where Eleanor was, but it simultaneously raised a far more terrifying one. Who? The logistics of such a crime were staggering. To move a body and conceal it in a freezer during a bustling, high-profile event without a single witness implied a level of control and audacity that was almost superhuman. This was not the work of a stranger or a panicked lover. This was the calculated act of someone who knew the estate's layout intimately, who commanded enough authority to move through the chaos of the party unnoticed, and who could ensure that this specific pantry would remain undisturbed for years to come. In that dusty, silent room, the list of potential suspects shrank dramatically, pointing directly toward the heart of the Caldwell family itself, a place where power could conceal the most monstrous of sins. The preliminary coroner's report landed on Detective Miller's makeshift desk with a quiet thud, its clinical language a stark and jarring intrusion into the opulent chaos of the Caldwell estate. The findings were immediate and game-changing. Eleanor Caldwell had not died from a gunshot, a stabbing, or any form of blunt force trauma. There were no signs of a violent struggle. The cause of death was asphyxiation, a quiet, insidious end. This single fact dismantled every theory of a panicked lover or a violent confrontation gone wrong. This was not an act of passion. It was controlled, clean, and terrifyingly intimate. It required proximity, planning, and a complete absence of struggle, suggesting the victim was either asleep or, more chillingly, incapacitated before her final moments. The mystery of her death had just become profoundly more sinister. The full toxicology report arrived less than 24 hours later, and it was the bombshell that blew the case wide open. Eleanor's system was flooded with a massive, lethal dose of benzodiazepines, specifically a potent sedative prescribed for severe anxiety and insomnia. The medical examiner was clear. This was not a recreational amount or an accidental overdose. It was a deliberately administered, overwhelming quantity designed to induce unconsciousness rapidly, leading to the suppression of her respiratory system. The peaceful, almost serene posture in which she was found in the freezer suddenly made horrifying sense. She hadn't fought back because she couldn't. She had been drugged into a placid, helpless state before being placed in her cold, steel tomb, a final, chilling act of desecration disguised as repose. With a grim sense of purpose, Detective Miller immediately cross-referenced the specific sedative against the medical histories of every key individual present at the estate on June 15, 2001. The digital search was swift and brutally efficient, cutting through years of privacy and privilege. It yielded a single, damning result. Richard Caldwell had a long-standing active prescription for that exact medication, issued by his private physician for chronic insomnia. Pharmacy records confirmed he had received a full 90-day refill, just 2 days before his daughter's wedding. The means of murder was no longer an abstract weapon. It had a name, a prescription number, and a direct, undeniable link to the grieving patriarch who had so masterfully controlled the narrative of his daughter's disappearance for 7 long years. This discovery forced Detective Miller to re-examine the case's foundational clue, the handwritten note, the romantic, desperate plea, "Meet me at the boathouse." Now seemed almost laughably convenient. It was a perfect piece of misdirection, a theatrical flourish designed to send investigators chasing a phantom lover, a mysterious A who likely never existed. The note had successfully diverted attention for days, leading to a fruitless search of the lake, while the real evidence rotted in the family's archives. Miller began to entertain a chilling new theory. The note was not a clue left by Eleanor, but a trap laid by her killer. A piece of evidence planted years later, a contingency plan for the day the walls of the estate finally began to talk. Shifting her focus from the now suspect love affair, Miller honed in on the one element of the note that still felt grounded in reality. Bring the documents. It was the cold, transactional heart of the message, and it suggested a motive far more complex than a broken engagement. Armed with a new, far more invasive warrant, she dispatched a team of forensic accountants to the corporate headquarters of Caldwell Industries in Manhattan. Their mission was not to look for embezzled funds or hidden accounts, but to reconstruct Eleanor's professional activities in the 6 months leading up to her death. Miller was no longer hunting for a jilted lover. She was hunting for a business rival, and she had a growing suspicion that the rival was a member of Eleanor's own family. Buried deep within the digital archives, under layers of encrypted files and password-protected folders, the accountants found it. The documents were not love letters or blackmail material. They constituted a brilliant and bloodless corporate coup. Eleanor had secretly retained a top-tier law firm to draft a share transfer agreement based on an obscure clause in her grandfather's original company bylaws. The clause allowed a direct descendant to claim a controlling interest upon reaching the age of 25 under specific conditions she had legally met. The document, once signed and filed, would have stripped Richard Caldwell of his executive authority, leaving him as a powerless figurehead. It was a declaration of independence, a meticulously planned rebellion that would have cost her father his empire. This revelation reframed the entire narrative of the wedding night. Eleanor's heated public argument with Julian was no longer a sign of pre-wedding jitters. It was a calculated piece of theater. It created the perfect justification for her to storm away from the reception, providing cover to execute the most important transaction of her life. She wasn't running from her future. She was striding toward it with a legal bombshell in her hands. The stakes of that night were not about love or marriage, but about the transfer of power over a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. The motive for stopping her was no longer a mystery. It was a cold, hard number with 9 zeros attached to it, a motive powerful enough to make a father see his own daughter as an existential threat. With this new understanding, Detective Miller began to piece together Eleanor's final hours with terrifying clarity. After the staged argument, Eleanor would have gone to her room to retrieve the signed documents. She was on her way to the boathouse, not for a romantic tryst, but for a strategic rendezvous with an ally, perhaps a lawyer or a loyal board member, the true A, who would help her finalize the transfer away from the prying eyes at the party. But she never made it. Someone intercepted her in the house. Someone who knew about her plan, who understood the catastrophic implications of those documents, and who had both the access and the authority to move through the estate unquestioned. The number of people who fit that description could be counted on one hand. The investigation had now officially escalated, spiraling beyond a domestic homicide into a potential conspiracy of corruption and power. Miller began to scrutinize the original 2001 police file, her experienced eye catching dozens of procedural anomalies. The initial inquiry had been shockingly superficial, accepting the family's runaway bride theory at face value, without exploring alternative leads. Key staff members were never formally interviewed, and forensic analysis of the grounds was cursory at best. It became painfully clear that the Caldwell family's influence wasn't just a matter of public perception, it was a force capable of neutering a police investigation, ensuring that the right questions were never asked, and the darkest secrets of the estate remained buried along with Eleanor. This seismic shift in the investigation sent shockwaves through Ethan and Claire's life. For Claire, the evidence pointing toward her uncle was a slow-motion psychological collapse. Every cherished memory of him, every moment she had sought his approval, was now poisoned by the monstrous possibility that he was her cousin's killer. The man she saw as a protector was being unmasked as a predator. Ethan, who had simply wanted to build a home office, now found himself and his terrified wife at the epicenter of a dangerous dynasty's implosion. They were no longer just the people who found the note. They were the ones who had lit the fuse. The grand estate, once a symbol of aspiration, now felt like a prison, its beautiful walls holding them captive with the very monster they had helped to expose. Detective Miller knew she was closing in, but she also knew that cornering a man as powerful and cunning as Richard Caldwell required more than just strong circumstantial evidence. She had the means, the motive, and the opportunity, but she lacked the final, irrefutable link, a confession or a witness. A direct confrontation would only allow him to rally his army of lawyers and stonewall the investigation indefinitely. She realized she couldn't break him with force. She had to break him with pressure. The next phase of her strategy would not unfold in an interrogation room, but in the suffocating atmosphere of the Caldwell mansion itself. She would turn the family's fortress of secrets into a psychological pressure cooker, convinced that if she just kept turning up the heat, the killer would make one final, fatal mistake. Detective Miller's strategy was one of psychological warfare, turning the sprawling estate from a sanctuary into a fishbowl. Her team's presence was constant but quiet, a fleet of unmarked sedans lining the driveway like patient vultures. She conducted her interviews not in intimidating rooms, but in the sunlit gardens and airy drawing rooms, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the grim nature of her questions. She spoke to everyone, from the current gardeners to the long-retired cook, piecing together a 7-year-old puzzle one memory at a time. Through it all, Richard Caldwell watched from his study window, a silent, calculating monarch, observing the methodical siege of his kingdom. He projected an aura of weary cooperation, but Miller saw the cold, strategic mind working behind his eyes, assessing her every move, searching for a weakness to exploit in her carefully constructed case. The first significant crack in the family's wall of silence came from a source Richard had long considered unbreachable, Mrs. Gable, the head of household staff who had served the Caldwells for over 30 years. During her third interview, Miller's gentle, persistent questioning finally eroded the woman's fierce loyalty. With a trembling voice, Mrs. Gable recalled a specific, unusual order from Richard on the morning after the wedding. He had instructed her to have the ballroom pantry, including the newly purchased industrial freezer, cleared and padlocked immediately. The official reason was for a deep pest control treatment, but she now admitted with tears welling in her eyes that no such treatment ever occurred. The pantry remained locked and forgotten for years. This was the first concrete piece of evidence directly linking Richard to the instrument of concealment, a calculated action taken in the chaotic aftermath of his daughter's disappearance. This new information sent a tremor through Claire, fracturing the last vestiges of her denial. The uncle who had once seemed like a pillar of strength was now morphing into a monster in her mind. She found herself lost in fragmented memories from that fateful night, images and sensations resurfacing with horrifying new context. She remembered seeing her uncle near the service corridor, not looking frantic or worried but unnervingly calm, his face a mask of cold composure. She recalled an offhand comment he'd made to her days later, that Eleanor had always been too impulsive for her own good, a phrase that had sounded like paternal concern at the time but now echoed with a chilling, dismissive finality. The weight of these resurrected memories was crushing, forcing her to confront the agonizing possibility that her entire life had been shaped by a lie, orchestrated by the very man she had spent a lifetime trying to please. Armed with this new timeline, Detective Miller brought Julian Vance in for another interview. This time he was not a suspect, but a potential key witness. In a sterile interrogation room, far from the opulence of the estate, Miller laid out the evidence of Eleanor's corporate takeover plan. She watched as Julian's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally, a dawning, sickening understanding. The heated argument on the terrace, the moment that had defined him as a jilted groom for 7 years, was suddenly recontextualized. He realized Eleanor hadn't been breaking up with him out of spite. She had been creating a necessary diversion. He had been a pawn, his very public heartbreak used as a piece of theater to provide cover for her real mission. The knowledge was a bitter pill, but it galvanized him, transforming his old grief into a cold resolve to help Miller uncover the full truth of Richard's deception. Meanwhile, the forensic accountants digging into the corporate archives unearthed the true identity of the mysterious A. The payment for the law firm that drafted Eleanor's share transfer agreement originated from a discreet, blind trust. The sole trustee of that fund was Andrew Whitehall, an elderly, semi-retired board member who had been fiercely loyal to Eleanor's grandfather and his original, more ethical vision for the company. The A in the note was not a secret lover, but a powerful corporate ally, a mentor who was helping Eleanor orchestrate her rebellion from within. This discovery was a tactical masterstroke for the investigation. It not only solidified the financial motive beyond any doubt, but also provided Miller with a credible, high-level witness who could speak to Eleanor's state of mind and the true nature of her conflict with her father, effectively destroying the runaway bride narrative forever. Miller's team located Andrew Whitehall living a quiet, secluded life in a rustic farmhouse in Stowe, Vermont. When Miller and her partner arrived, they found an old man with sharp, intelligent eyes that held the weight of a long-held secret. Initially, he was guarded, his loyalty to the Caldwell name, even to its tarnished legacy, deeply ingrained. He listened to Miller's questions with a stony silence, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, the only sound in the room. But when Miller produced a copy of the share transfer agreement, the document he had helped Eleanor draft, his composure finally broke. He recognized it as the culmination of a young woman's dream, a dream he had watched turn into a 7-year-long nightmare. The sight of that paper, the legal weapon that should have secured her future, was the key that unlocked his silence. Whitehall's testimony was the linchpin that connected all the disparate pieces of the case. He confirmed he was the A Eleanor was supposed to meet, not at the boathouse, but in a discreet town car waiting at a service entrance. The boathouse meeting was a fabrication, a detail he was certain had been invented. He recounted Eleanor's growing fear of her father in the weeks leading up to the wedding, her conviction that he would do anything to stop her from taking control of the company. Most damningly, Whitehall revealed that Richard had personally visited him a week before the wedding, issuing a veiled but unmistakable threat to both his pension and his reputation if he continued to support Eleanor's plan. This was the proof of premeditation Miller needed, transforming the crime from a possible accident into a calculated plot to eliminate a rival. This revelation of a premeditated corporate battle prompted Miller to secure a warrant for the original 2001 police investigation files. What she found was not just incompetence. It was a clear pattern of willful negligence that bordered on a cover-up. The lead detective on the case, a man named Frank Rizzo, had accepted the runaway bride theory with almost no critical examination. He had failed to interview key staff members, including Mrs. Gable, and had dismissed the concerns of Eleanor's closest friends. A deeper financial probe revealed the final, damning piece of the puzzle. 6 months after closing Eleanor's case, Detective Rizzo had taken an early retirement, paying off his substantial mortgage in a single cash payment. The payment was traced back to a shell corporation with deep, albeit laundered, ties to a Caldwell Industries subsidiary. The case had now officially escalated into a full-blown conspiracy. It was no longer about a single, tragic murder confined to the walls of a wealthy estate. It was about a web of corruption that extended into the very law enforcement agency meant to uphold justice. Richard Caldwell hadn't just killed his daughter. He had used his immense wealth and influence to buy the silence of the police, ensuring his crime would remain buried. Detective Miller realized she was not just fighting a powerful man, but an entire system he had manipulated for his own protection. The stakes had been raised exponentially. Exposing Richard now meant exposing a corrupt detective and implicating the department in a massive, 7-year-long cover-up, a move that would make her powerful enemies and place her, along with her key witnesses, Ethan and Claire, in considerable danger. Feeling the net tightening around him, Richard Caldwell finally abandoned his passive, cooperative facade and launched a vicious counteroffensive. He unleashed his formidable legal and public relations teams, who began a systematic campaign to discredit everyone involved in the investigation. Articles suddenly appeared in tabloids and financial journals painting Detective Miller as a reckless cop with a personal vendetta against a grieving family. Ethan was portrayed as a gold-digging outsider, a greedy architect looking for a payday by fabricating a conspiracy. Claire was painted as a mentally unstable and jealous cousin, long resentful of Eleanor's success. It was a brutal, character-assassinating strategy designed to poison the well of public opinion and undermine the credibility of any potential jury, a stark reminder that Richard's power was not just in hiding secrets but in manufacturing lies. The public onslaught was relentless, placing Ethan and Claire under an unbearable siege. Reporters camped outside the estate gates, their cameras and questions a constant, invasive presence. They were ostracized by the remaining family members, their calls going unanswered, their presence met with icy glares. The pressure culminated in a call to Claire from one of Richard's senior attorneys, a man whose voice was smooth as silk, but whose words carried the cold weight of a threat, reminding her of the fragility of her and Ethan's reputations. But the intimidation had the opposite effect. Instead of breaking them, it forged their fear into a diamond-hard resolve. That night, sitting in the oppressive silence of the mansion, Claire turned to Ethan, her eyes clear and unwavering. "He's not just a killer," she said, her voice low but firm. "He's a monster who has controlled all of us. And we have to be the ones to stop him." Detective Miller orchestrated the final confrontation not in a cold, sterile interrogation room, but in the lion's den itself, Richard Caldwell's study. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with the scent of aged leather, cigar smoke, and 7 years of unspoken truths. Sunlight struggled to pierce the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, accusatory shadows across the priceless Persian rug. Ethan and Claire sat on a small sofa, their presence a silent, powerful indictment. Miller stood opposite Richard's imposing mahogany desk, a calm epicenter in the brewing storm. The only sound was the relentless, metronomic ticking of a massive grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile silence, counting down the final seconds of a dynasty built on a monstrous lie. This was not an interrogation, it was an exorcism, and the ghosts of the past were finally demanding their due. Miller began not with an accusation, but with a story. Her voice was low, and even as she calmly narrated the timeline of June 15, 2001, her words painting a vivid picture of the celebration and the tension that simmered just beneath its surface. As she spoke, she placed a single, glossy photograph in the center of the polished desk. It was Eleanor, captured moments before the reception, her smile radiant, her eyes full of a future she would never see. The image was a silent, heartbreaking witness, its presence a stark contrast to the grim reality of the conversation. Richard's gaze flickered to the photo, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He sat behind his desk like a king on a throne, flanked by his lawyers, but the photograph had already breached his defenses, a poignant reminder of the vibrant life he had extinguished. The first piece of hard evidence landed on the desk with a soft, clinical whisper. It was the toxicology report. Miller didn't read the jargon. She translated it into a simple, brutal fact. A massive, lethal dose of benzodiazepines, Richard. Enough to render a person unconscious within minutes and stop their breathing. She let the words hang in the air before sliding a second document next to the report. The pharmacy records. "Your prescription," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "For this exact medication. A full 90-day supply, filled just 2 days before your daughter's wedding." Richard's lawyer began to speak, to object, but Richard raised a single, silencing hand. His eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's smiling face, the mask of the grieving father now a fragile, cracking veneer. Next came the testimony of Mrs. Gable, a story of loyalty twisted into unwitting complicity. Miller recounted the housekeeper's tearful confession, Richard's specific, urgent order on the morning of June 16th to have the ballroom pantry cleared and padlocked. "For a deep pest control treatment. That never happened," Miller clarified, her gaze locking with Richard's. "It was a room full of old furniture and linens." Why that room, Richard? Of all the storage spaces in this mansion, why the desperate need to seal off the one containing the brand-new industrial freezer? The grandfather clock ticked on, each sound amplifying the weight of the unanswered question. In the suffocating silence of the study, the mundane act of locking a door had been transformed into the first, crucial step in a 7-year cover-up. Then, the motive. Miller placed a thick, bound document on the desk, the share transfer agreement. This wasn't about a secret lover, was it? It was about this. She methodically detailed Eleanor's brilliant, bloodless coup, a legal masterstroke that would have stripped him of his empire. She followed it with a summary of Andrew Whitehall's sworn statement, confirming not only his role as Eleanor's ally, but also the direct, personal threat Richard had made against him just 1 week before the wedding. She wasn't running away from a wedding, Richard. She was running toward her future, a future you were about to be written out of. The carefully constructed narrative of a flighty, emotional bride dissolved completely, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of a multi-billion-dollar power struggle. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, as the true stakes of that night were finally laid bare. The dam of Richard Caldwell's composure finally began to break. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a noise of pure, primal rage. His lawyers shifted uncomfortably, but they were powerless to stop the inevitable collapse. She was reckless, Richard hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. She would have destroyed everything my father and I built. Decades of work, undone by a child's idealistic fantasies. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He was no longer speaking to Detective Miller or his lawyers. He was addressing the ghost in the photograph, the daughter whose ambition had mirrored his own too closely. His confession began not with remorse, but with a torrent of justification. The angry, resentful tirade of a deposed king, blaming his heir for his own downfall. Miller then turned her gaze to Claire, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. "Claire, please, tell us what you remember," with Ethan's hand gripping hers. Claire spoke. Her voice was a fragile thread in the heavy silence, but it carried an undeniable strength. She described seeing her uncle near the service corridor, long after Eleanor had supposedly vanished. "He wasn't panicked," she whispered, her eyes locked on Richard. Everyone was frantic, searching, calling her name, but he was just calm, so terribly calm. This memory, delivered by his own niece, was a more devastating blow than any piece of forensic evidence. It was an intimate betrayal, a voice from within his own bloodline, testifying not to his actions, but to the cold, unnatural state of his soul in the immediate aftermath of the murder. The final, crushing piece of the puzzle was the note itself. Miller placed the small, yellowed paper, now sealed in an evidence bag, beside the other exhibits. "We analyzed the ink and the paper, Richard. The paper is old, from a batch of stationery discontinued in the late 90s. But the ink is less than 2 years old." She paused, letting the implication sink in. "And the handwriting, though cleverly disguised, contains microscopic loops and pressure points that are a perfect match to your signature on corporate documents from 2008. You didn't find this note, Richard. You wrote it. You planted it for Ethan to find. A desperate, last-ditch effort to create a phantom lover if the secret you buried ever came to light. The boathouse, the mysterious A, it was all a lie, a final, calculated deception from a master manipulator." With a roar of fury, Richard Caldwell slammed both fists onto his desk, the sound explosive in the tomb-like silence. The photograph of Eleanor jumped, landing face down. It was the final, violent act of a cornered animal. "She wouldn't listen," he bellowed, his face contorted in a mask of rage and self-pity. The confession, when it came, was a torrent. He described confronting Eleanor in her bedroom as she prepared to leave with the documents. He pleaded, he threatened, but she stood firm, her resolve as unyielding as his own. "I just wanted to stop her," he choked out, the words tumbling over each other. "To make her miss the meeting, to make the documents worthless. I never meant for her to die." The admission, stripped of all its power and prestige, was the pathetic, whining excuse of a tyrant who had lost control. He recounted the chillingly simple mechanics of his crime. He had gone to his private bathroom, crushed several of his potent sleeping pills into a fine powder, and dissolved them in the glass of water Eleanor always kept on her nightstand. He offered it to her, a seemingly paternal gesture to calm her pre-wedding jitters. He watched as she drank it, his mind coldly focused on a single outcome: inducing a deep sleep that would last for hours, long enough for her ally to give up and leave. He described sitting in a chair in the corner of her room, in the dark, waiting for the sedative to take hold, the architect of his own daughter's incapacitation, all to protect the empire he valued more than her life. The clinical detachment in his voice was more horrifying than any scream. The horror escalated as he described his fatal miscalculation. The dose was too strong, her system too exhausted. He watched, frozen in a state of cold panic, as her breathing grew shallow, then ragged, and then, with a soft, final sigh, it simply stopped. The silence that followed, he admitted, was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. In that moment, his focus shifted instantly from containment to concealment. The problem was no longer a rebellious daughter, but a body. His mind, always the strategist, scanned the estate for a solution. The industrial freezer, new, unused and in a forgotten pantry, presented itself as the perfect, ice-cold tomb. A place of pure utility that no one would ever have a reason to open. A perfect hiding place in the heart of his own home. With a chilling, logistical precision, he detailed how he waited until the last of the staff had gone to bed, the estate finally quiet in the pre-dawn hours. He wrapped Eleanor's body in a heavy linen sheet from her own closet, placed her on a service dolly from the kitchen, and wheeled her through the silent, sleeping mansion. He recounted the strain of lifting her into the freezer, the final, soft thud as her body settled inside, the definitive click of the heavy lid sealing her away from the world. He then padlocked the pantry door, creating the first layer of his 7-year deception. He had treated the disposal of his own child's body with the same dispassionate efficiency as a hostile corporate takeover, a final, monstrous testament to where his priorities had always truly lain. His confession finally sputtered out, leaving a gaping, toxic void in the room. The story, in all its ugly detail, hung in the air, a permanent stain on the opulent study. Richard Caldwell was no longer a titan of industry or a powerful patriarch. He was just a murderer, shrunken and pathetic, exposed by the truth. Claire's quiet sobs were the only sound, a heartbreaking requiem for her cousin and the family she had once known. Ethan held her tightly, a stoic anchor in her sea of grief. Detective Miller gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The heavy oak doors of the study swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The arrest was a formality. The real sentence had already been passed in the silence that followed the confession. A life of power and prestige irrevocably ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet final click of handcuffs. The trial of Richard Caldwell was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a public dissection of a dynasty, a media spectacle that held the nation captive. The courtroom in Stamford, Connecticut became the stage for the final act of a 7-year-long tragedy. Richard's defense team, a formidable assembly of the country's most expensive lawyers, fought with surgical precision. They painted their client not as a monster, but as a desperate father who made a catastrophic error in judgment while trying to protect his impulsive daughter from ruining her own life. They argued the overdose was a tragic accident, and the concealment was an act of panic, not malice. They portrayed Ethan as a gold-digging opportunist, and Claire as an emotionally fragile, easily manipulated witness, attempting to poison the jury against the very people who had unearthed the truth. The entire strategy was a masterclass in deflection, a final, desperate attempt to control a narrative that had long since spiraled beyond his grasp. The prosecution, led by a sharp and unyielding district attorney, methodically dismantled this carefully constructed facade. They presented the evidence not as a series of isolated facts, but as an undeniable, chronological chain of premeditated murder. The jury was shown the pharmacy records, the toxicology reports, and the forensic analysis proving Richard had written and planted the note years after the fact. Andrew Whitehall's testimony was a turning point. His calm, credible account of Richard's threats against him, providing clear evidence of premeditation. The prosecution argued that this was not about a father's love, but about a titan's ego. Richard Caldwell, they contended, valued his corporate empire more than his own child, and when she threatened to take it from him, he eliminated her with the same cold, calculated efficiency he would have used in a hostile takeover. It was a crime born of greed and a pathological need for control. Julian Vance's testimony was a study in quiet dignity and profound regret. On the stand, he faced the man who had allowed him to be the prime suspect and the subject of public scorn for 7 years. He recounted the argument on the terrace, his voice steady as he explained how he finally understood it was a piece of theater, a necessary diversion for Eleanor's true plan. He told the jury about Eleanor's passion, her brilliance, and her unwavering determination to reshape the family business into something more ethical. His words painted a portrait of a woman who was not a flighty runaway, but a visionary on the verge of claiming her destiny. He was no longer the jilted groom. He was the final, credible witness to the character of the woman Richard had tried so hard to erase, and his testimony systematically destroyed the last remnants of the runaway bride lie, leaving only the cold, hard truth. The emotional climax of the trial arrived when Claire took the stand. Facing her uncle across the courtroom was the most difficult thing she had ever done. Her voice, though trembling at first, gained strength as she spoke. She didn't just recount facts. She described the suffocating atmosphere of the Caldwell estate, a world governed by unspoken rules and her uncle's absolute authority. She spoke of her love for Eleanor, a love tangled with envy and admiration. Her most powerful testimony came when she described Richard's unnatural, chilling calm on the night of the murder, a stark contrast to the frantic panic of everyone else. In that moment, she was not just a witness. She was the conscience of the family, a voice from within the fortress of lies, and her words resonated with the jury more deeply than any piece of forensic evidence ever could. The jury returned its verdict after just 5 hours of deliberation. As the foreman stood, a profound hush fell over the packed courtroom. The word guilty, when it was finally spoken, was a clean, sharp sound that sliced through 7 years of silence and deceit. Richard Caldwell, charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, did not flinch. He sat perfectly still, his face a mask of stone, his eyes empty. It was the final, chilling display of a man whose control was so absolute that he refused to show emotion, even as his entire world crumbled around him. A quiet sob broke from Claire, a sound of grief, of release, and of a strange, hollow victory. The king had fallen, his reign ending not with a roar, but with the quiet, final pronouncement of a single, damning word. Richard Caldwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his final remarks, spoke of a betrayal of the most sacred trust, that of a parent to a child, calling the murder an act of unfathomable selfishness and moral bankruptcy. The fall of the Caldwell dynasty became a modern American epic, a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of absolute power and wealth. The family name, once a symbol of prestige and influence, was now irrevocably tarnished, synonymous with a monstrous crime hidden in plain sight. The opulence of the Greenwich estate, once featured in architectural magazines, was now seen for what it was: a beautifully constructed mausoleum, a gilded cage that had guarded a dark and terrible secret for far too long, its flawless facade finally shattered for the world to see. The shockwaves of the verdict extended far beyond the Caldwell family. The revelation of police corruption led to a sweeping investigation into the Greenwich Police Department. The retired detective Frank Rizzo was indicted for accepting bribes and obstructing justice, his quiet, comfortable retirement shattered by the echoes of his past misdeeds. The scandal forced a complete overhaul of the department's cold case unit and led to stricter protocols for handling cases involving influential families. Detective Ava Miller was promoted, her methodical, unintimidated approach to the investigation becoming a new standard for the force. In a strange and tragic way, Eleanor's murder ultimately brought about a form of justice that reached far beyond her own case, cleansing a system that had failed her so profoundly 7 years prior. Caldwell Industries, the empire Richard had killed to protect, could not survive the scandal. In the wake of the verdict, its stock plummeted, and the board of directors moved swiftly to contain the damage. They ousted every executive loyal to Richard and initiated a complete corporate restructuring. The company was eventually sold off in pieces, its assets absorbed by competitors, and the Caldwell name was scrubbed from every letterhead and building. The legacy Richard had so desperately fought to control was ultimately erased, dismantled by the very crime he committed to preserve it. In a final, bitter irony, the company's new leadership, under pressure from shareholders, implemented many of the ethical and sustainable reforms Eleanor had championed, her vision for the future finally realized in the ashes of her father's ruin. Ethan and Claire could no longer bear to live within the walls of the estate. The mansion was not a home. It was a crime scene. Every room and hallway saturated with the ghosts of the past. They sold the property to a developer who, in a move that felt like a final cleansing, had the main house demolished. With the proceeds, they moved to a quiet town on the West Coast, seeking a life of anonymity and peace. They established the Eleanor Caldwell Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to funding scholarships for women in business and providing legal support for corporate whistleblowers. It was their way of honoring Eleanor's true legacy, not as a victim, but as a brilliant and courageous woman who fought for what was right, a tribute that ensured her spirit would endure long after the memory of her father's crimes had faded. For Claire, the resolution was a painful but necessary rebirth. The trial forced her to confront the toxic dynamics that had shaped her entire life, breaking the psychological hold her uncle and the family legacy had on her. In testifying against him, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked cousin living in Eleanor's shadow. She was a survivor, a woman who had faced the monster in her own family and chosen to stand for the truth. The process of healing was long and difficult, but with Ethan by her side, she slowly began to build a new identity, one defined not by the name she was born with, but by the choices she had made. She was finally free. The antique lace veil, the delicate object that had started it all, found its final resting place in a museum exhibit on famous American crimes. Encased in glass and illuminated by a single soft light, it was no longer a symbol of a wedding that never was, but a testament to a truth that refused to be buried. Visitors would look at the intricate patterns of the lace and the seed pearls that shimmered like frozen tears, and they would remember the story of Eleanor Caldwell. The veil served as a powerful, tangible reminder that even the most fragile things can carry immense weight, and that secrets, no matter how deeply they are hidden or how powerful the people who guard them, have a way of eventually, inevitably, finding their way into the light. Months later, Ethan and Claire stood on the porch of their new, smaller home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The silence that surrounded them was different now. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of the Caldwell estate, which had been thick with unspoken secrets and fear. This was a peaceful silence, a quiet born of resolution and a hard-won sense of closure. They had lost a part of their past, but in doing so, they had gained a future, one they could build on their own terms, founded on honesty and love. The memory of Eleanor would always be with them, not as a ghost, but as an inspiration, a reminder that the fight for truth, no matter the cost, is the only thing that truly sets you free. The final question of the mystery, the identity of the mysterious A, was answered with the conviction of Andrew Whitehall's testimony. He was the ally, the mentor, the one waiting to help Eleanor usher in a new era for her family's company. The boathouse, the midnight meeting, it was all a fabrication, a clever piece of misdirection planted by a killer to send investigators on a wild goose chase after a phantom lover. Richard had underestimated the persistence of justice and the simple, human curiosity of an architect who noticed a wall that was just a few inches too deep. In the end, every lie was exposed, every question answered. The veil of silence that had shrouded the Caldwell family for 7 long years had finally and irrevocably been lifted, leaving only the stark, unvarnished truth in its place. The story of Eleanor Caldwell did not end with the sound of a gavel or the clang of a prison door. It found its true conclusion in the quiet moments that followed, in the lives that were irrevocably altered by the truth. For Ethan and Claire, the sprawling, manicured prison of the Greenwich estate was replaced by a modest home overlooking the Pacific, where the only secrets were the ones the ocean kept. They channeled their pain into purpose, creating the Eleanor Caldwell Foundation, a living testament to the woman whose voice had been stolen. Through scholarships for aspiring female executives and grants for corporate whistleblowers, they ensured that Eleanor's true legacy, one of courage, vision, and an unwavering commitment to ethical leadership, would not be defined by her tragic end, but by the countless new beginnings she posthumously inspired. Her name, once a symbol of a family's dark secret, became a beacon for a new generation of leaders. The silence that had once defined the Caldwell dynasty was finally broken, but a new, more profound quiet took its place. It was not the oppressive, heavy silence of buried secrets, but the peaceful stillness that follows a devastating storm. The grand estate, once a symbol of impenetrable power, was razed to the ground, its foundations dug up and replaced with a public park, a final, symbolic act of returning the land to the light. The name Caldwell, once whispered with reverence in boardrooms and at charity galas, was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the most formidable walls are not built of stone and steel, but of lies. And like any poorly constructed wall, they are destined to crumble under the simple, persistent pressure of the truth, leaving nothing but dust and regret in their wake. In the end, Eleanor Caldwell was not remembered as a runaway bride or a tragic victim. The trial had resurrected her, not in body, but in spirit. The world came to know her as she truly was, a brilliant strategist, a compassionate visionary, and a woman who possessed the rare courage to challenge a titan, even when that titan was her own father. Her plan to reform Caldwell Industries, the very act that signed her death warrant, became her ultimate victory. In the ashes of her father's empire, new companies rose, guided by the ethical principles she had championed. She had lost the battle for her life on that warm June night, but in the long arc of history, she had unequivocally won the war for her legacy, proving that a powerful idea can never truly be silenced. The antique lace veil, the fragile catalyst for the entire revelation, found its final home behind the climate-controlled glass of a National Museum's exhibit on infamous American crimes. It rested on a simple velvet cushion, illuminated by a single, soft spotlight. To the thousands of visitors who passed by, it was a beautiful, haunting artifact, its intricate floral patterns and shimmering seed pearls telling a story of love, betrayal, and murder. It was no longer a symbol of a wedding that never was, but a powerful testament to the fact that truth can be hidden in the most delicate of places. The veil, which had once concealed a secret note, now served to reveal a universal truth that even the most carefully constructed facade can be unraveled by a single forgotten thread, patiently waiting in the darkness to be pulled. The shockwaves of Richard Caldwell's conviction radiated far beyond the confines of his family, triggering a painful but necessary reckoning within the very institutions he had corrupted. The Greenwich Police Department was forced to confront its own complicity, leading to the indictment of the retired detective and a complete, transparent overhaul of its internal affairs and cold case divisions. Detective Ava Miller's unwavering, methodical pursuit of justice became a new standard, a case study taught in academies across the country. Eleanor's death had exposed a rot that ran deeper than a single family, revealing how easily the scales of justice could be tipped by wealth and influence. Her tragedy became a catalyst for reform, ensuring that future victims would not be so easily erased by the powerful men who sought to silence them. Richard Caldwell lived out the remainder of his days in the stark, sterile environment of a maximum security prison, a world stripped of the power and privilege that had defined his entire existence. He was no longer a titan of industry, but an inmate, a number in a system he could not control. He never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the monstrosity of his actions. To the very end, he remained trapped in a prison of his own making, his mind a fortress of justification and self-pity. His story serves as a chilling reminder that the most profound evil is often not born of chaotic passion, but of a cold, rational, and unwavering belief in one's own entitlement. He was a man who had everything, and, in his desperate attempt to keep it all, was left with absolutely nothing. Ultimately, the fall of this great American dynasty was not orchestrated by a rival corporation or a team of seasoned investigators, but by the quiet, methodical curiosity of an outsider. Ethan, the architect who simply wanted to build a home office, became the unwitting key that unlocked a 7-year-old tomb. His story is a testament to the power of observation, to the importance of questioning the things that seem just slightly out of place. He was not a hero on a quest for justice. He was an ordinary man who stumbled upon an extraordinary secret and found the courage not to look away. His actions prove that sometimes the most monumental changes are set in motion not by a grand design, but by a simple, persistent tap on a hollow wall, listening for the echo of a truth that refuses to stay buried. The story of the Caldwells became a modern legend, a dark fairy tale of wealth, power, and the corrosive nature of secrets. It demonstrated how one family's implosion could trigger the reform of a city's police force, the collapse of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and the quiet rebirth of the survivors who chose to stand for the truth. But the dark currents of influence and corruption that ran beneath the surface of this one family are not unique. What other secrets lie dormant behind the flawless facades of the powerful, waiting for a single loose thread to be pulled? The fall of the House of Caldwell was a seismic event, but it was not an isolated one. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger. In the end, the most enduring legacy of the Veil of Silence is not found in the headlines or the court transcripts, but in a simple, universal truth that was proven with devastating clarity. Power can build empires, wealth can buy silence, and fear can hold secrets for years, even for generations. But these are temporary defenses against an eternal force. The truth requires no army and commands no fortune. It needs only a single voice, a single crack in the wall, to begin its inexorable journey into the light. For the truth doesn't make a sound when it finally arrives. It's the profound, deafening silence that follows the collapse of a monumental lie that changes the world forever.